The film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Well, it's long stood as this towering critique of oppressive authority, right? You have the free spirit, McMurphy, sacrificed by the crushing weight of the system. But, if we re-examine the source material, a pretty compelling alternative reading emerges. It suggests that while the system is definitely present, the tragedy is fundamentally a consequence of, well, a complete failure of management. So today, we're asking the crucial question: is the ultimate tragedy we see in the film fundamentally down to specific poor management decisions and, let's be honest, the personal defects of the administrator, Nurse Ratched, or does it reflect something deeper, an inherent flaw in the institutional structure itself? My position is that the horror, the two deaths, the escape, it's rooted directly in Nurse Ratched's administrative incompetence and, crucially, her avoidable errors.
That's an interesting way to put it, though I guess I frame it differently. While I absolutely acknowledge that Nurse Ratched's actions were, atrocious, focusing just on her specific administrative blunders, I think, risks missing the forest for the trees. I'd argue that the ultimate destruction stems not from Ratched's management technique or, lack thereof, but from a really profound systemic failure. The tragedy, for me, is rooted in the inherent oppressive nature and the underlying power structure of that asylum. That structure allowed her arbitrary control and violence to be sanctioned, maybe even encouraged. She wasn't just some isolated bad actor. She was effectively an agent of a destructive system.
Okay, but if we look closely at the details, Ratched's execution, her management, created what the source calls a double loss. The patient suffered devastatingly, and the hospital's own mission was completely undermined. Now, this outcome wasn't inevitable. I really believe it was entirely attributable to a manager who was inflexible and, frankly, simple and crude, as the analysis puts it. We can actually categorize her failures pretty clearly. The first, and maybe the most foundational one, was a lack of a core objective. The hospital seemed to fail entirely to establish its core value, the treatment and cure of spiritual illness. The metrics they should have been tracking were cure rates, recovery grades. Her focus on just superficial orderliness meant this fundamental oversight, ignoring the actual mission, it was overlooked. And related to this, she practiced what the critique terms lazy governance.
Her priority was simply maintaining stability, keeping the ward quiet, clean, predictable, over the really difficult, exhausting work of solving problems and ensuring effective treatment. She ignored signs that her, frankly, punitive group therapy sessions were failing precisely because it was just easier to maintain that surface order than to actually try and heal people.
I'm just not convinced that administrative oversight alone explains the profound level of damage she was able to inflict. You cite her lack of focus on cure rates, but why was she allowed to prioritize orderliness in the first place? That's the key question for me. Ratched is, yes, a manager, but the system allowed her to operate essentially as an unchecked ruler. And I think this distinction is critical because the system provided the tools necessary for genuine psychological and ultimately physical obliteration, all under the guise of treatment. Look, an incompetent manager might fail to get results, sure, but only a truly oppressive system provides the mechanism for something like electroshock therapy and then ultimately a lobotomy to convert a non-compliant patient, a troublemaker, maybe, into, as the film shows, a genuine idiot. And furthermore, the system actually seemed to reward deceptive behavior.
Think about the way Ratched instantly escalated the doctor-patient relationship into an adversarial one. It was through systemic tools, controlling the patient's own cigarettes, property they'd purchase, under the pretense of stopping gambling, that immediately put her in charge of their personal property, their autonomy. This shows a profound systemic failure regarding patient rights and oversight, enabling her to act tyrannically over even these minor details. And crucially, she appeared competent to her superiors simply because she maintained this facade of control and orderliness. It shows the institution valued that control way above any human cost.
Okay, that distinction between manager and ruler is powerful. I grant you that. But I do worry it oversimplifies her specific blunders, the things she did that really accelerated the outcome. Consider her third failure,
what the analysis calls overreaching authority. She unilaterally engaged in matters far beyond her scope, right? Like changing the schedule specifically to deny the patients the baseball game. That kind of scheduling decision, that should have been the domain of the doctors or maybe a higher board. When a manager steps outside clear boundaries like that, and she did it again by impulsively calling for that vote, that sort of pseudo-democratic process she clearly never intended to honor, she invites, practically guarantees conflict. She escalated the situation completely unnecessarily by exercising authority she didn't or shouldn't have technically possessed. And this leads directly to the fourth and I think most destructive managerial error: personalizing the conflict. The moment she allowed her professional duty to devolve into a personal grudge against McMurphy, the tragedy really did become inevitable. Remember, the management layer, the doctors, were considering sending McMurphy back to the labor camp because, well, he wasn't genuinely insane. It was her specific, highly emotional choice to insist he remain for treatment, essentially blinded by hatred. That was the single decision, I argue, that led directly to the final fatal conflicts. So the tragedy, in this sense, was absolutely contingent on her inability to manage her own professional distance.
Let's pick up on that point about the voting manipulation, because I think that beautifully illustrates the institutional problem. You view her manipulation of the votes, first requiring 9, then unilaterally bumping it to 18, then just claiming time was up, as a failure of leadership consistency, a poor technique that alienated the patient camp, as you put it. But I'm sorry, I just don't buy that this was merely bad execution or poor technique. The very fact that a single middle-aged nurse managing only 18 patients could so easily and unilaterally change the fundamental rules of the ward 3 times without any apparent immediate intervention from a regulatory body, a review board, or even a supervising physician, that proves, to me, that the rules themselves were just instruments of power. They were entirely discretionary. So if the rules are just arbitrary dictates like that, then the problem isn't really that the manager failed to follow procedure. The problem is that the system gave her the absolute authority to define and redefine reality on a whim, with 0 patient appeal, 0 managerial accountability. That power dynamic is inherently oppressive, frankly, regardless of who happens to be managing it at the time.
While I absolutely concede that the system allowed her to possess that, let's call it operational flexibility, it was the poor leadership technique that ensured the conflict exploded. I mean, imagine if a more skilled manager had handled that request for the baseball game, maybe by engaging in some kind of constructive negotiation, or even just firmly denying the request from the outset based on established hospital policy, whatever it was. The point is, the patient camp likely wouldn't have coalesced against her in the same way. Her arbitrary reversals, changing the rules mid-game, that was a textbook example of how not to lead. It turned a simple scheduling request into basically a declaration of war. A competent administrator knows how to mitigate conflict. Ratched's rigidity and her inconsistency actively manufactured it.
But the potential for that conflict, maybe even the inevitability of it, was baked into the institutional design itself. The structure dictates that the manager must maintain control, above all else it seems. Ratched simply used the institutional tools provided to her to maintain it. And this moves us naturally to the ultimate consequence, doesn't it? Could that catastrophic ending, the deaths, the escape, have truly been avoided if the manager hadn't been motivated by that personal grudge, as you say? You suggest that if she had just been professional, sent McMurphy back to the labor camp, the final deaths wouldn't have occurred. That specific emotional choice, you argue, caused the catastrophe. But I think this overlooks the incredibly powerful institutional levers that were already in place and ready to be pulled. Take Billy Bibbitt's suicide. It was triggered not just by Ratched's anger, sure, but by the specific, authorized threat of informing his deeply controlling mother. That's a powerful institutional lever, isn't it? Wielded by the nurse over a patient she knew was deeply vulnerable to that specific threat. And McMurphy's fate, that swift, brutal obliteration of his mind via lobotomy, that was triggered only after he crossed the institution's ultimate physical boundary by attacking her, by choking her. The readiness and the sheer brutality of that response demonstrates that the institution's tools of destruction were primed and ready to be deployed. I'd argue that any patient who sufficiently challenged the absolute power structure might well have met the same ultimate systemic consequence, regardless of Ratched's specific managerial style.
Okay, I see why you think the lobotomy felt like an inevitable systemic response, but I still believe we have to prioritize the specific choices that made that deployment necessary in this instance. The fact remains that Ratched actively chose to keep a non-mentally ill patient, McMurphy, in a mental institution primarily out of vengeance. The tragic consequences that followed the party, Billy's intense trauma leading to suicide, and McMurphy's eventual violence, they all flow directly from that one emotional, unprofessional management decision. Yes, okay, the system provided the mechanism, the lobotomy, but Ratched, through her actions, provided the context and ultimately the reason for it to be deployed. If she had maintained professional distance, that entire catastrophic scenario likely never would have unfolded. And maybe we can trace the cause even further back, looking at the core mission again. Is the failure to focus on cure rates merely a managerial oversight, like I suggested, or is it actually a symptom of the asylum's deeper, flawed nature? I still lean towards it being a core administrative failure, that lazy governance, which, in theory, is easily corrected with proper accountability. The nurse was lazy in her goals because her operational aim was merely stability, not the difficult, messy, often uncomfortable process of actual problem-solving and cure. Look, if the hospital board had been active, if they'd been demanding measurable therapeutic outcomes and holding Ratched accountable for them, this focus on just superficial order would have been exposed as the incompetence it was. It would have been impossible to sustain.
But that line of reasoning assumes the institution actually wants to cure people as its primary goal, or at least that its primary function isn't ultimately about control. I'd argue the system structurally allows orderliness to be easily mistaken for competence. It lets that surface tidiness entirely replace the real goal of healing. So this managerial laziness you describe, this tendency to abandon the fundamental goal for an easier one, it's inherently facilitated by a structure where control is clearly prioritized over compassion. The system, it seems, is designed to prefer the quiet, the compliant, the controlled patient, almost regardless of their therapeutic progress or lack thereof. So Ratched, therefore, appeared capable to her superiors precisely because she delivered what they valued, a quiet, organized ward. In effect, the institution had already divorced its definition of success from actual patient outcomes. It valued its own seamless, quiet operation above all human cost. So, if the system demands and rewards superficial control, then the manager who provides that control, even if they have moral failures, is, in a way, acting exactly as the system requires. The true failure, then, is in the structural incentive itself.
Indeed. And I think the film really demands that we look beyond that initial, maybe somewhat romantic reading of just freedom versus system. We need to recognize the profound impact of administrative failure. Our discussion today, I think, confirms that the disastrous outcome was, at least in large part, the direct result of using an incompetent manager, one who is rigid, overly centralized in her power, and clearly fueled by personal resentment. Had the hospital employed, say, a flexible manager focused on established cure rates and actual patient well-being, the specific, avoidable choices that led to the final conflict very likely would have been mitigated.
And yet, I think our debate has also shown that while the nurse's incompetence certainly amplified, perhaps even accelerated the disaster, the root cause really lies in the structure that permitted a manager to wield such absolute arbitrary power. It enabled her to unilaterally redefine rules and deploy brutal, destructive tools like the lobotomy under the guise of treatment. The institutional design, which effectively guaranteed Ratched could act with impunity, also, I believe, guaranteed conflict and tragedy. Poor management just poured fuel on an already burning fire.
It seems understanding the full weight of the film's tragedy really does require analyzing both, doesn't it? The specific human failures within the hierarchy and the profound institutional framework that permits and perhaps even encourages those failures to become so lethal.
Yes, a crucial reminder, I think, that often the most destructive forces aren't just individuals, but individuals granted absolute administrative authority by a negligent or perhaps even deliberately structured system.